Thanks. So good morning, good evening, and thanks to everyone involved in the organization of the seminar. All right, so we were asked to think through and beyond the apparent contradiction between centrality and periphery. And what I'm going to do is to interrogate this nexus from the perspective of a third concept, informality, which brings, I hope, additional insights and tensions to the discussion. Now, the category of informality is, of course, problematic. Actually, at some point, I will shift to the alternative formulation of popular urbanization. But let me first suggest some aspects which are often elided in the conventional use of this notion. We tend to associate the idea of informality with unplanned and squatter settlements in the global south. But these dynamics have been not only present, but indeed central to the historical development of many cities in Western countries as well. In fact, as we shall see in my presentation, unplanned urbanization has sometimes worked as a fundamental vector of spatial and regulatory change in peripheral areas in the north, or even as a key contrasting feature in the development of a notion of normative urbanization, informing the very evolution of planning. And I would argue that this too is a form of centrality, as we will see. Centrality is often conceived as a topological and functional condition and framed as a sort of zero-sum game or balance. So, you know, agglomeration processes condense centrality in specific places to the detriment of others, which become subordinated as peripheries. But what if centrality is not only a spatial and functional relationship, but also a political condition, an inexhaustible political capacity? And what if these spaces traditionally understood as quintessential peripheries, you know, self-built illegal settlements inhabited by disenfranchised populations, what if these peripheral spaces are actually a crucial engine of political centrality and social change, and therefore a vital moment of urbanization? Today, I shall explore these issues by looking at the case of Madrid between the 1940s and 1970s, which is the period of the fascist dictatorship in Spain. Following the Civil War, the outskirts of Madrid developed as a belt of shantytowns housing over 30,000 families. This came to be known literally as the problem of the suburbs. So while in other Western countries, suburbia was expanding as a privileged realm for the middle and upper classes, in Spain, the suburb literally was identified with the lowest strata of a working population and defined as a reality below dominant urban and social standards. The magnitude of this phenomenon in Madrid and the capacity of these communities for political organization and centrality threatened the urban vision of fascism and shaped the planning agenda during this period. All right, so before focusing on the case study, let me stop for a minute to consider the notion of centrality and its connection to informal urbanization. I will draw today on Henri Lefebvre's theorization of the concept, which differs from the conventional use in several ways. So Lefebvre gave two interrelated meanings to this category. In the first and more traditional conception, centrality designates the very essence of the urban. It is the condition of simultaneity and complexity that results from the encounter of activities and people in the process of agglomeration. And it's important to note that for Lefebvre, centrality is not necessarily circumscribed to the historical or spatial centers of cities. It is an emergent condition that can develop anywhere. In a second, closely related but more speculative conception, Lefebvre also framed centrality as a political substance, a political capacity. It is a concentration of power in space expressed through the ability of certain groups to hold a central place in the decisions that shape collective life. And in this sense, centrality becomes a sort of spatial infrastructure of autonomy. It's a material, functional framework or platform that also nurtures the collective skills required to lead social processes and define or contest spatial and political hierarchies. From this perspective, we may say that certain configurations of centrality foster cohesion and empower communities, while others may be used to reinforce social hierarchies, segregation, to subordinate subaltern populations, and so on. So urbanization in this sense is informed by struggles between conflicting centrality projects. So it is important to understand who determines these hierarchies, who demarcates the relations of centrality, for whom, and to what ends. Informal urbanization is, I would argue, a critical process through which these struggles unfold. And from now on, as I said, I will actually use the notion of popular urbanization. This concept has been long used by colleagues in Latin America and more recently by Christian Schmidt and his collaborators to designate forms of urbanization from below, in which markets and state agencies play minor roles. For Schmidt and his collaborators, these processes are, quote, based on collective initiatives, collective work, and self-organization. Everyday experience and practice play a key role in these dynamics as they generate not only material outcomes, but also deep local knowledge. And these practices and knowledge nurture alternative solidarities that, quote, challenge the vision of hegemonic urban space. Right, of course, other related categories could be invoked here, such as James Halston's idea of insurgent urbanism, Teresa Caldeira's peripheral urbanization, and so on. But wherever the terms, and to go back to the idea of centrality, I suggest that these forms of collective urbanization outside state control are a fundamental vector of alternative centralities in the double sense mentioned above. The often peripheral communities that animate popular urbanization acquire centrality, this capacity to shape urban life in places, through the practices of self-organization that sustain these processes. All right, so with this in mind, let's now look at the history of popular urbanization in Madrid. In the 1940s, after the Civil War, it was a period of extreme economic hardship in Spain. Housing became a major issue, particularly in Madrid, coinciding with the arrival of tens of thousands of migrant families trying to escape poverty in the countryside. And the authorities, the fascist authorities, tried to stop this massive rural exodus in several ways, including, as you can see in this movie poster, there were even films encouraging Spaniards to stay in the countryside and avoid the dangers of the city. However, the inflow of migrants continued unabated in the following years. And as time went by, more and more families settled in self-built dwellings, shanties, and even, as you can see here, in so-called caves on the outskirts of town. By the early 1960s, as I mentioned before, a conservative estimate suggested that there were at least 32,000 households in these conditions. Most of the buildings were illegal, but the residents usually owned the land. The land was designated for agricultural use, but the original owners parceled it out and sold it in very small plots to poor families, even if construction was not permitted. So whole areas were arranged in this fashion. You can see a detail here. And they included a rudimentary street layout. When they parcel out, they included a street layout. And actually, it is quite fascinating to find some big names in the history of Madrid's real estate connected to these processes. Anyway, beyond these rudimentary organization arrangements, the initiative, the building of the settlements was led by the residents. The houses were often relatively solid. In fact, the residents often got loans to buy the materials from respectable financial institutions. So as I mentioned, when we use this language of informality, shantytowns, we usually think of makeshift dwellings, but here, as in many other places, this preconception is quite misleading. The residents had certain property rights, the buildings were relatively durable, and the process of urbanization was loosely connected to so-called formal real estate and financial markets. More importantly, the settlements certainly had a strong sense of cohesion, identity, and community, sustained to a great extent, I should say, by women. So this is not to idealize or romanticize these places. To be clear, the dwelling conditions were often extremely harsh, but to refer to them as marginal or informal is inaccurate. Yet this is the way they were framed by state and planning agencies. All the different building typologies were designated as shanties and defined literally as suburban, as I said, as a reality below the urban, insufficient to reach a properly urban standard or to be recognized as part of the city. The suburb was framed in a way as planning order, and of course this simplicity and inaccuracy were deliberate. They amplified the stigma of these areas and legitimized interventions against them. But why were these spaces problematic? Because after all, the inhabitants were conventional construction and industrial workers. They were not outlaws. Well, they posed a problem of public order at several levels, I would say. Some had to do with everyday aspects. To begin with, these were ambiguous places, somewhere between the urban and the rural. For instance, as you can see, migrants preserved their customs when they settled, and they often kept livestock at home. And this hybrid urbanization regime was per se a challenge to ongoing elite attempts to consolidate a modern notion of what a city was, what belonged in the city, and so on. More importantly, these settlements were soon politicized through everyday struggles to survive and became incubators of working class descent. And self-management was a key aspect in this process. The residents set up their own rudimentary infrastructures and organized their own services, including not only water supply and sanitation, electricity, and so on, but they also set the street markets. They created their own facilities and leisure spaces, rudimentary libraries, festivals, sports associations, and so on. And in some cases, this led to the creation of formal consumer cooperatives, which were often more efficient and affordable than regular markets. At a time when free association was illegal in Spain, some of these communities created loose workers' associations, which worked as mutual support platforms. Then they went on to establish residents' committees, which became the seats of a neighbors' movement that later played a key role in the transition to democracy. And sometimes they even chose their own mayors, which of course was illegal, especially considering that in some cases, these so-called mayors had a problematic political past for the regime. During much of the 1940s, the government turned a blind eye to this phenomenon, but towards the mid-1950s, in the context of growing social unrest, the approach began to change to prevent the penetration of social conflict in these areas. And at that point, you can already see how these spaces gain centrality and shape the policies of the day, even in a negative or repressive fashion. I mean, the connection of social housing and town planning policy, which took place for the first time in Madrid in this period, was to a great extent determined by the challenge of informal settlements, and it became framed by a broader attempt to police these forms of popular urbanization. Then later in the late 1950s and early 1960s, several programs were launched to demolish the shacks. Part of the inhabitants were relocated in so-called absorption settlements, which became a laboratory for young architects to experiment with new social housing and satellite urbanization schemes. And some of the projects were interesting. You can see here one of them, which is quite renowned, Caño Roto. But to be honest, many of them were, as you can see in this alternative formulation, some of them were a little bit too crude. And in any case, although they had a positive impact on the city's housing stock, they were not enough to solve the problem of the suburbs, which continued to exist and sometimes expand in the 1960s and early 1970s. More importantly, political activity in the settlements also intensified during this period. Faced with the threat of displacement, the residents strengthened their positions and developed close connections with the struggles of industrial workers and university students against the dictator. The residents demanded that not only their houses, but also their communities and associations were recognized. They, of course, kept fighting to get basic services, but they also created food banks. They protested the price of basic goods. If they accepted the renovation of the neighborhoods, they required to participate in the new designs. They even built their own model apartments to show planners what they wanted, you know. So again, as you can see, there are evidences of popular capacities for innovation, to be ahead, to keep a proactive role in urban change. And in the 1970s, many residents' committees also became undercover cells for clandestine political activity, especially the Communist Party, and played a key role in the transition to democracy. And in fact, the most ambitious planning initiatives when democracy was reestablished in Madrid took place in these peripheries and were a direct response to their demands for centrality. I should only mention, to save time, that the neighborhood renovation plan in the late 1970s, which kept the residents in their areas and incorporated higher facility and building standards. And then in 1984, a master plan for the whole city, which emphasized the provision of public services on the outskirts and tried to support community life in these areas. All right, so to sum up, my aim today was to provide evidence of the importance of popular urbanization in the evolution of urban peripheries and policies and urban policies in Western countries. We have seen how the inhabitants of Madrid's shanties built their settlements, put up basic services and facilities, developed a sense of community and solidarity, and produced a hybrid spatiality that ran against dominant visions of urbanity. In some, they produce their own centrality in the double sense suggested above. First, they organized their settlements with a certain degree of self-sufficiency and functional complexity. And second, in that process, they also acquired a capacity to play a central role in the dynamics that shaped place and social change in Madrid. And they did so not only under extremely harsh living conditions, but also in the face of a ruthless dictatorship. In that sense, I suggest that despite their material poverty, these experiences provide an interesting illustration for those willing to develop a project of urbanization based on alternative centralities. And perhaps, as Paul suggested at the beginning, also an inspiration for community activists and progressive planners at a time when the ghost of the far right is again on the rise in many places across the world. Thank you.
Excellent, Álvaro. Amazing. It's a pity Roger's not here. I think he'd be particularly excited about your Lefebvrean analysis on things there, and the whole idea there of, I suppose, multidimensional facets of implosions and explosions going on kind of horizontally and vertically in terms of morphology, social reactions, political conditions, and then also that kind of, that community reactions to things as well. So really, really fascinating stuff. So I'm going to open it up to the floor again. So if anybody has any questions or comments, I'm keeping an eye on the chat, but by all means, raise a real hand or raise a virtual hand, and we'll try to get to you. Carola, yes, excellent. Yes, of course.
I'll just jump in. No, excellent speech. And I think you raised a number of points that I've also been trying to struggle with or thinking about, because this whole theme of what is actually peripheral to what is something that we should discuss, and who decides what it is. So this whole idea of political construct is key, of academic construct is key, but that's already what you're doing. I'm just wondering if you have given any thoughts to the actual institutions in charge of these.
But do you refer to the institutions in charge of the popular initiative? I mean, informal institutions, or the formal, the authorities, the planning institutions?
All of the above. So the whole institutional dimension and how this intersects.
All right. So I would say, so going back to the idea of centrality as a political process that shapes a space, not only the other way around, I would say that these emergent centralities, at some point, they have to create their own institutions to consolidate and survive, especially in the context of in such a difficult context as the one I was talking about. So in the case of these informal communities or popular communities, at some point, as I mentioned, they had to create their own associations, organize, and at some point it was clear that they needed to be recognized. So at some point there's a clash between institutions. In a way, it's, as I said, what this process of urbanization, popular urbanization, reveals is that urbanization is shaped by conflicting ideas of centrality from different institutions, state institutions on the one hand, and in this case also grassroots institutions. And their ideas of centrality, at some point they have to clash. And perhaps planning, what we understand as planning, as professional planning, is a way to mediate these conflicts and to find a way out. This is what happened in the 1980s, when democracy was reestablished. There was a new generation of young, progressive planners that made it possible to find a consensus between these so far antagonistic realities of the state and grassroots movements or social movements. So I don't know if that answers to your question, but yes, I would say that if we see centrality as a process that can emerge everywhere and from different groups and polities, then we have to deal with this fact that urbanization is itself an ongoing process of struggle around centrality, and perhaps we can find new avenues for new strategies to develop our profession too, our practice as planners, I would say.
Thanks, Álvaro, for your response, and Carola, thanks for your question. I see Nick has a virtual hand raised, so Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Álvaro. Really enjoyed that talk. Thought it was really interesting that, you know, people like Mark have been pioneering sort of planners holding exhibitions and ways of getting the public interested in planning, and you gave that example of the people taking an exhibition to the planners, you know, constructing a dwelling unit and saying this is what we want. So a really intriguing sort of reversal there. The question I wanted to ask is a bit, it's a little bit cheeky in a way, and but the Spanish case is almost it's really quite well known, and you know, many of the things that you said, obviously, not just well known, but it's a sort of almost an extreme example of the political centrality of the suburbs. You know, people like Manuel Castells writing about it. So I'm just wondering whether that popular urbanism takes anywhere near that expression elsewhere in the world that you can think of, or whether it takes sort of slightly less powerful forms, but is there nonetheless. You know, I mean, you can see I've probably got some ideas myself behind that question, but I was intrigued to hear from you as well.
Yeah. Yes, it is an extreme case, perhaps because of the context of the dictatorship at the time. It was a country, a developing country at a time. You may argue, some might argue that actually Spain was part of the global south at that point, because it was a late developer. And so there were strong social forces rising, and then the context of the political regime and so on. And it's difficult to find the same kind of concoction elsewhere. But I would say that elements of what I've said are present in most of the cases you see described in the literature today. I mean, this idea that grassroots urbanization or grassroots settlements have to develop their own forms of organization, and at some point create associations of some nature. I see it almost everywhere. Perhaps they lack this last step of also incorporating the political, the more partisan political position, which was specific to the political context in Spain at that time. But I would say that it's not difficult to find these forms of these elements of self-management, of course, and as a necessity, self-organization and self-institution is kind of an instituent process what these communities are developing, constituent or constituent, whatever term you want to use. But in a way, they acquire this political presence through the very process of organizing their settlements. I wouldn't agree that it is that difficult to find these elements in other places today.
Fantastic. I see Laura has her hand up. Laura, over to you in London.
In London's periphery. Indeed, on an old Roman road leading to a Roman settlement. Yes, just to comment on the previous question, Ruth Glass, who at the time was Ruth Durrant, the name of her first husband, wrote a very interesting social survey on Watling, which was a new suburban housing estate on the edge of London. And she commented there, this was a working class post-World War I displaced community, and she wrote there that the lack of support from the surrounding communities and from the centre led to them forming, I think she counted something like 40 local community organisations. So an interesting example, not from Spain, but just to say, Álvaro, I loved your presentation and so beautifully illustrated. Anyway, yeah, I really enjoyed that. And a quick question, because we're running out of time. Just bringing the spatial into this conversation, I was just wondering to what extent what was then peripheral, to what extent has the location of those informal settlements been integrated spatially into Madrid's street network, or can it still be identified quite easily on the map?
Absolutely. Yes, of course, the settlements have been absorbed by, I mean, they were already no longer suburban or detached from the city in the 1970s, 1980s. At the end of my presentation, they were already absorbed by urban development, urban growth. And in some cases, there are still traces of these street layouts that this kind of sort of criminal element. The only criminal element in the story is actually the original owners of the land who divided it and sold it to poor families coming from the countryside who were ignorant and thought that they could build there in many cases. But so, and these were the people, the original owners who developed these early arrangements, layouts, and in some cases they remain, but for the most part they're gone. In this late 70s, early 1980s neighborhood redevelopment plan, which I briefly mentioned, many of the settlements accepted to be that their communities were reshaped as long as they could participate in the design. And it was a strong moment of participation, like an inaugural moment of democratic planning in Spain and participatory planning in Spain. And for the most part, many of these places were completely transformed in the process. And some would say, actually, sadly, because there were some potentials in the original schemes, you know, that were lost in the new plans. There was a brief slide I think I used where you could see these towers emerging in a sea of low-rise, actually 1 floor, 2 floor houses, and most of this surrounding sea was later demolished. Some say that there were intrinsic potentialities in those sort of tissues, you know, but for the most part, they're gone. They remain in some areas of the south, of the southern outskirts, in Vallecas particularly, but yeah, for the most part, they're gone.